Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
First of all, I'd like to thank Matthew Colburn for his insight on his persuasive, well, I'm not going to talk about what he did to persuade us to have this, but it was very honored. Thank you. Thank you, Dean. Dr. Jowers for spearheading this entire project or initiative. But I just wanted to let you know that my hesitation at first, when I read the title, Public School Discipline, I remember my own high school days. While I was never put out, expelled, put on probation, or whatever, I did engage in quite a number of disruptive kinds of experiences. Now, you know, disruption back then was not a good thing, but disruption now seems to be what everybody does. So I did download my article, so I'm well prepared for the panel. That's not to scare you off. But I'm learning a lot about restorative justice and all of that. I wish they had that back in my day. It might have bring some meaning to the kinds of behaviors that I was exhibiting at that time. But it is a wonderful opportunity for us to explore a very sensitive issue that seems to be center stage in our nation, in our nation's public schools. So thank you once again for bringing this to light and for engaging in the discussion around this particular issue. Thanks.
Now we are going to ask Professor Colburn, Matthew Colburn, who has been an adjunct professor of English here since January of this semester. And we are very pleased and honored that he's with us. We thank him for his initiative and his creativity. The idea for doing these panels, number one, because we are a public institution. We are a community college that deals with a variety of populations, and we believe that we are best prepared to be a leader in certain areas. And it is our responsibility as the city's only public community college to take lead in some of the challenges and issues of higher education. So we will be coming to you periodically, as I said, with other panels related. And now Matthew is going to come and he's going to introduce our panelists, and we're going to start our program. Matthew?
First, I'd like to thank Dean Hamilton and Dr. Jowers Barber for giving me the privilege of putting on this panel and moderating it. Thank you very much for your support, both of you. And thank you also to Dr. Summers. It's my privilege to moderate this panel on an issue of great importance. In 2012, the Education Department, under the direction of President Obama, released statistics that showed a racial disparity in public school discipline. To give you one figure, in Chicago, this is from the New York Times, Black students made up 45% of students, but 76% of suspensions. When those figures came out, there was a sea change in the past 5 years in suspensions and expulsions across the US. In an NPR article that my students have read, it was reported that 27 states in the past 5 years have revised their laws with the intention of reducing suspensions and expulsions. And that is the context for our discussion. And now I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Ms. Darby Hickey, who has joined us from DC Councilmember Grosso. She is a senior legislative analyst, and she deals with issues of the school to prison pipeline as a member of the council and the chairperson of its committee on education. I'd like to welcome Professor Cecelia Alvarado, who is the Education Program Coordinator at UDC CC. Professor Alvarado is an assistant professor in education, where she began in 2010. She works with organizations such as Teaching for Change, 0 to 3, the National Council of La Raza, and the National Black Child Development Institute. Professor Alvarado. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Michelle Cokehill Chatman, our esteemed professor from UDC, the Van Ness campus. She is an assistant professor of crime, justice, and securities, and she teaches courses in restorative justice, urban youth, and justice in a multicultural society. Dr. Chatman. Each of our panelists is going to give a 5-minute opening statement, and then the rest of this time will be dedicated to conversation. We very much want to hear from students, hear their questions, comments, and experience and perspectives on this issue. And this will be a conversation. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to our panelists. And by a random coin toss, Darby Hickey, would you like to start? And then we'll go in this order. Thank you.
Good morning. How y'all doing? So I'm here representing Councilmember David Grosso. He is your council member. He's at large, meaning he represents the entire city. And we are down at the Wilson Building at 1350 Pennsylvania Avenue. That's our state capitol building. Hopefully y'all have been down there or aware of it. Come on down and visit us. The council member's office is in 402, and the Committee on Education, of which he is the chairperson, is in room 116. We always welcome visits from community members, constituents, and particularly from students as the Committee on Education. So the council member has been pretty involved in the issue of the school to prison pipeline and addressing the problems of racial and gender disparities in school discipline, as well as coming to understand how exclusionary discipline, that is suspending kids, putting them out of school, even putting them out of the classroom without necessarily giving them any sort of support within the school, really actually doesn't serve anyone. It certainly doesn't serve the student in question, and it doesn't actually really make the class any safer necessarily. Obviously, there are situations when someone's in a crisis and they need support and they need to be removed, but we see how these out-of-school suspensions, expulsions, just really can have pretty dramatic a negative impact on the students, and there is emerging research that it actually negatively impacts the other students in the classroom as well. So the council member, he joined the council in 2013. He was elected in 2012. He's an independent, and he was on the Committee on Education. And his first act, actually, as a council member, his first legislative act, was to get included an amendment in a bill that was passed at the time called the Attendance Accountability Act. And he asked that within that act, that schools be required to collect and send data on their out-of-school suspensions and expulsions to the Office of the State Superintendent for Education, which we call OSSE, so that we could get an understanding of, we hear a lot about it on the national scene, but what does it actually look like in DC? How many suspensions were we seeing? How many kids were getting suspended? Who were the kids? Who were the students, the young people? What was their racial background? What was their gender? What was their special education status? We know that's a huge area of disparity across the country. And so that first report came out in 2014, and that had, as you might not be surprised, some very disturbing numbers in it, including that 180 students across DC in public schools and public charter schools had been suspended who were 3 and 4-year-olds, which really is very surprising in a way, and shocking. And especially it came right at the time when we were, as a city, as a district, trying to make pre-K, so for those 3 and 4-year-olds, an early education available to everyone in the city. And yet here we are kicking them out of school. So he then became the chairperson of the Committee on Education in 2015, and his first bill that he introduced and passed, and actually it was the first bill introduced in the entire session, so it's called Bill 21-1, was a prohibition on suspension and expulsion for pre-K students, as well as greater reporting requirements. The original reporting requirements focused on what was already kind of required to be reported to the federal government, and a little bit more than that. And so it looked a lot at violence, at weapons, but we knew there was a whole other world of suspensions going on that didn't have anything to do with violence or weapons. And that report came out, and we saw that, in fact, the vast majority of out-of-school suspensions in DC, I should say that the plurality, are for non-violent, for purely behavioral incidents, talking back, defiance, not listening, goofing around, basically. Stuff you might expect, kids, young people to do. And so the council member, wanted to continue to give time and put money into, we put money in the budget towards restorative practices, as was discussed, towards bringing more supports into school, mental health supports, community organizations. But he also knew that there was going to be a time when he was going to ask schools to do more. And that's what he's currently doing. We're developing legislation. We've been meeting over the past 6 months or so with experts, with school leaders, with parents, with advocates that work with students kicked out of school every day to develop some legislative language that the council member will introduce in 2 weeks at the November 21st legislative meeting of the DC Council. And we're still finalizing it, but in broad strokes, what that bill will do is it will prohibit out-of-school suspensions for students in grades 8 and below, with the exception of severe incidents of physical or emotional violence, as well as some incidences with weapons, which are federally required. It will also put some limits on high school out-of-school suspensions and expulsions that will say that issues like the behavioral issues I was describing, defiance, not listening, cannot be a reason to be suspended. Being late to school or missing school cannot be a reason to be suspended. Having on the wrong uniform or not wearing your uniform cannot be a reason to be suspended. 1 or 2 other things, but we leave in the schools a broader leeway in the high school context. And then we'll continue to put resources into helping them, because the number one thing that schools say to us is, well, if we can't suspend students, then what are we supposed to do? Which we say there's a lot of things you can do, but we are committed to continue, the council member is committed to continue to support schools to implement restorative practices, address their school climate, help students that have serious behavioral challenges, give the supports they need. And one more thing that we're including in the bill, there's some other things, but one other thing is, because we know there's such a great disparity for students who are students with disabilities, we're going to make it a little bit harder to suspend a student with a disability. Not to say that they don't need to be held accountable for their actions, they should be, just the same as their peers. But because of this great disparity, we want to really set a little bit higher bar on making sure that the suspension in response to behavior, that the behavior isn't as a result of their needs not being met, that they may have special education needs that aren't being met, and that's causing the behavior. So look out for that. That'll be coming out pretty soon. We'd welcome, we don't know when we'll have the hearing yet, but probably in January. We'd welcome anyone to come and testify, and we'd be glad to talk with anyone and receive feedback on the legislation.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
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 Thank you so very much for having me. Actually, you all should be thanking me, because I graduated UDC class in 1993. So I was here before most of you students. It is wonderful to be here. I teach in the Crime, Justice, and Security Studies program, and I'm an anthropologist with also some background in sociology. And this is really important because what we're talking about is racial disparities in how children and youth are treated in schools. And I'll talk about what restorative justice is in a moment, but I think one aspect around this that we need to deal with a bit more directly and strategically is how we understand and misunderstand race. How we differentially value Black students and white students and Latino students and disabled students and homeless students and poor students. Because if we're talking about racial disparity, we can certainly legislate treating students and children differently in schools, but that doesn't necessarily change our attitudes and ideas and perceptions around race. So why is this necessary? Going back to the study that Ms. Hickey cited, in the summary of findings, it says that 11 states, including DC, reported higher gaps in the nation between the suspension rates of African American students and white students for both boys and girls. Arkansas, District of Columbia, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Missouri, Nebraska, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and Wisconsin. In DC, DCPS students were 1.58 times more likely to be disciplined than charter school students. African American students in DC schools, DCPS and charter schools, were almost 6 times more likely to be disciplined as were white students. Latino students were just more than 2 times more likely to be disciplined than white students. So it's obvious to me that we've got some issues around race that we need to unpack and really address. So restorative justice and other alternative diversionary approaches to dealing with behavior or offenses offers us an alternative. It is not a panacea. Restorative justice is a philosophy, it's a worldview that says we all live in relationship with one another. We are interdependent. And when I commit an offense, when I harm you, I need to address that harm and I need to try to repair that harm. It also says that when I harm you, it is because somehow I feel that I'm not in relationship to all of you. And I would submit that when our children live in poverty, when our children have to get their breakfast from the dollar store or the corner store before they come to school, when our children have to work to help support families, when our children grow up in communities that are ridden with trauma, stress, and violence, that's an offense to them. And they don't feel a part of society. And they take this trauma and this stress combined with the typical challenges that young people and teenagers and kids do, just the typical behavioral, developmentally appropriate stuff that kids do, they take all that to school. But our system is so punitive in its nature, not just in schools, but sometimes even in our homes. We're very punitive. We rush to punishment rather than rushing to understand, why was this offense committed? What does this child need? What does this young person need? How can we repair this young person, this family, this community, this neighborhood, this society? So restorative justice says, rather than expel or suspend kids, let's try some different approaches. Let's gather those young people in circle with the people they have offended, whether it's a teacher or another student. Let's bring their supports to that circle, their parents, their guardians, whoever is responsible for their care. And let's really have a discussion, a moderated discussion, using some values and principles about what has taken place, who has been harmed, and how we can repair that harm. And I think we need to engage in that process as a country. South Africa did it with Truth and Reconciliation. I think we need to do that as well, along with changing legislation, along with changing practices in schools, along with improving communities so that children are not neglected and poor and feeling outside of us. So restorative justice is rooted in indigenous wisdom from New Zealand, from Canada, from the indigenous peoples of those areas, but it's very much aligned with the way many other cultures see the world, as us being in relationship and connected to one another. And when we harm one another, we harm ourselves and we harm the community, and we can repair that harm. Restorative justice says that at times our justice system causes more harm than good, because the focus is on what laws have been broken and how can we punish that person for violating laws. It doesn't say how can we heal the person who has been robbed or raped. So that's, in a nutshell, what restorative justice is. It's hard to talk about these big concepts and really complex issues in a few minutes, but I am extremely grateful for this opportunity to contribute to this conversation.
As an early childhood educator, I'm going to begin from that perspective, also because I believe that it is in the early years that life patterns are learned and set and establish the pathway upon which all young children journey into youth and adulthood. From a study conducted in Illinois, Rosemary Allen quotes statistics that 1/3 of all preschool teachers studied expelled at least one child each year. Preschoolers were expelled 3 times more than all children in grades 12, K through 12 combined. 40% of all the child care centers in the study reported suspending infants and toddlers as well as preschoolers. African Americans made up 19% of the population studied, but they comprised 50% of all the children and youth suspended or expelled. Children who are suspended are 10 times more likely to enter the juvenile justice system. They're more likely to drop out of school, have low academic achievement, and be suspended again and again and again. The literature has begun to refer to this trend as the preschool to prison pipeline. So why is this happening? Allen states the key to managing the difficult behaviors of children and youth is to build strong, positive relationships with students. I would add, adults also need to understand the racial complexities and the rampant racial disparities that exist throughout our country. Students care about the important adults in their lives and what they think of them. The key for adults is to become self-aware, to know what are their bottom hot button items and how can we respond to those behaviors with our body language, our words, and to step in and see our own retaliatory behavior toward our students. Behavior problems are defined by the person who's most annoyed by them. School expulsions are not child behaviors. School expulsions are adult behaviors. Dr. Becky Bailey, an international expert in childhood education and developmental psychology, talks about the psychology of well-being, in which children and youth are either in a state of social connectedness or in a state of chronic stress and deep pain. This chronic stress and deep pain is created by negation and rejection that shuts down the higher centers of the brain and eliminates a child's ability to self-regulate and make healthy choices. In this reactive brain state, depending upon the reaction of the adults, a child can move to a more accepting state of higher centers in the brain, or can shift to a survival state in the lower self-centered areas of the brain. Students need to feel comfortable, to feel they belong, and are not pushed out. And yet in most schools, the goal is to get rid of conflict, and sometimes those who bring it. And at best, establish external rewards and punishments that are used in hopes of controlling someone else's behavior. Then we wonder why these interventions don't work or gains are short-lived, even though they have nothing to do with building relationships and addressing racial disparities. Relationships are the central motivator in everyone's life. The essential impulse in all life is the will to connect. Rules don't govern behavior, relationships do. When we put a child in timeout or take away a prized activity or shame them in front of their peers or threaten to call the parents if their behavior moves them from yellow light to red light, or eliminate recess or participation in after-school athletics, or condemn youth to detention or a one-day suspension for missing school for a day, or heaven forbid, expel them entirely, what do we think we are teaching? Are we teaching conflict resolution? Are we teaching and modeling relationship building? Are we teaching how to connect with the learning community? Sadly, no. In this country, children and youth have been expelled from schools for cursing, wearing dreadlocks, digging a hole in the playground, dressing differently, taking heads, arms, and legs off dolls, a behavior that the teacher called demon-like, kissing a classmate on the cheek, and even a girl expelled for reporting she had been raped. I do believe there are mistaken behaviors by students that need to be addressed, but it's the inappropriate and ineffective behaviors by adults that are keeping those mistaken behaviors in place.
Thank you to each of our panelists. Very stimulating opening statements. I have many questions, but I don't think I'd be setting the right tone that I tried to set at the beginning if I asked my own questions first. So I'd like to hear from a student. Any student who has a question relating to this topic or to what was said in the opening statements. I have a bias, and I'm going to pick on one of my Saturday students who has joined us today.
Good morning again. Good morning. So part of what I'm going to say is a question, but also sharing my personal experience. It's been less than, I would say, 2.5 months of the start of this school year, and my son has been given in-school suspensions about 3 times already. And from the start, I asked to be informed if he was in jeopardy. Also the policy and procedures surrounding in-school suspension, and who the contact person is, and I have yet to receive that information. So I would like to ask Ms. Darby, will this be included in Mr. Grosso's legislation as well, as far as the, I think more grounded policies and procedures surrounding how much authority a school has to just give in-school suspensions and not give any means of communication to the parent?
That's a really great question. And it's actually something we've struggled with a little, how to define an in-school suspension. Because as we see schools, we've really seen schools take a big shift, even without our legislation, which is really exciting. Not all schools, and so that's why we're legislating, but and so many of them are adopting restorative practices, mindfulness, positive behavioral interventions, a lot of different techniques, some of which do involve bringing the child out of the immediate classroom, but not just putting them in a room, but with like a teacher, but actually into another very kind of loving and supportive and nurturing environment that might be about counseling and helping them sort out what's going on. It might be more just like, okay, you just need a little time away, come on over, let's work together over here. And so that's where we've had a little challenge with trying to figure out how to really differentiate between those things. That being said, one of the components of the bill is that we do require them all schools to have a discipline policy. to communicate it clearly to parents and students, to actually develop it with input from parents and students, and to lay out really clearly what are the steps that happen, what behaviors can lead to what kind of interventions or consequences, and what do parents do in terms of due process to find out what's going on, who do they contact. Of course, I'd be happy to talk with you, offline about how we can help with that particular situation. But this is also an area where I think it kind of goes back to Dr. Chatman's point, which is that there is only so much we can do as we legislate. And I think you saw that a little bit earlier this year when it came out that a bunch of schools, high schools, had been marking students not as suspended and not sending home any materials that they've been suspended, but marking them down as either present, and they weren't, or actually as marking them down as unexcused absences, which actually can land you in court if you're a parent for kids under 13, and if you're a student for kids 13 and above. So it's, we have to continue, and as a community, and not just as a legislative branch, and not just as the schools, but as a community, we have to continue to demand accountability. We have to continue to demand a shift in our thinking. And this is another big pushback we've gotten is, well, parents are gonna say, that kid cussed out my kid, why, or is bullying my kid, why isn't that kid suspended? And we get those calls a lot at the council. I wanna know why that kid wasn't suspended. And we need to help parents in the community, not only parents, but everyone in the community, to understand that suspension is not the helpful response, that there are many other responses. And that's a harder lift. We can't legislate that, right?
Is there another question from a student? Please share your name with us.
Good morning, my name is Joel Bernola. This is a question for all three panelists. I was raised biracial. I'm actually Black Italian. And for a long time, ever since I was 8 years old, I had struggled with identity issues because of things that happened in school. Besides some discrimination from fellow students, I also had problems in high school even in high school where, people were surprised when they see my mother, who is has more melanin than I do. And, they had somewhat of the audacity to ask if I was my mother's son. Sorry, I still struggle when I talk about this. So what I ask is, what is going to be done that's going to address that issue with students who are mixed, that they aren't going to have to deal with the identity issues that I have dealt with?
I'm going to answer your question and also refer to what you just were talking about in terms of the in-school suspensions where people go to another classroom and all of that. And it just sort of came to me that when these kinds of incidents happen, maybe there should be a strategy for dealing with the child in the situation, but maybe there should be a mandated strategy for dealing with the teacher. Where the teacher has to go to some sort of a process to dialogue with somebody about what happened and how they responded in that situation. Because right now, what you're talking about is it's all focused on the child and their behavior, but the teacher just goes on doing whatever she or he was doing. And I think with respect to how people have responded to you, someone needs to step in and intervene and take issue with those teachers or students, whoever it is that's making that statement to you. But I think what happens is that teachers in our schools are scared to death of these issues. They don't know what to do. And so they come down hard, or they go to where they've heard from someone else dealing with this issue. They react, they don't think. So I think we need to do massive professional development with teachers around all of these issues, but particularly the one around mixed children, because again, they don't know that perspective. They haven't learned in their teacher education, and I'm a teacher educator, and I know what goes on in teacher education around the country, and this is an area that doesn't get addressed like a lot of the other areas that should.
Right on. Joel, can never cry alone. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And thank you for sharing your case as well. And I'm very sorry that your son and your family is experiencing what you're experiencing. We really do need to do a better job of teaching about the multiple identities that we all hold. We all need to do a better job, and we can begin in this room with ourselves, with this conversation, dialoguing about what is race and understanding that it is a social construction, and understanding that it was a system created to oppress a certain people and to retain privilege for certain people. It's connected to power, and we can shift that imbalance of power. We're doing it today by acknowledging and speaking to the elephant in the room that teachers are afraid of speaking of. They're not trained to have intelligent conversations around. So we all need to do a better job at that. And to your question, I believe that most schools have a parent advocate. So it seems that there should be some more support for you in trying to navigate or negotiate what's happening with your son at his school. I believe there's a parent advocate office that's part of the DC public school system. So if you haven't already, I suggest reaching out to them. But overall, we need to do a better job. We need to have more of these sorts of conversations about how our young people are being impacted in schools. And not all young people have the resilience to continue coming to school. A statement like that, a question like that, an incident like what your son is facing can lead children to drop out of school. And as Ms. Darby said, and Dr. Alvarado, that increases young people's vulnerability for becoming involved in the justice system, for being victimized in the street by folks who want to take advantage of them. It can open the doors to a whole bunch of other unintended consequences and problems.
So we actually have a student advocate for the entire city. It's the Office of the Student Advocate. Individual schools have them as well, for sure, but I just wanted to read out their number. It's the Office of the Student Advocate, 202-741-4692. We also have an Ombudsman of Public Education in DC. And that position is meant, the advocate is really meant to advocate for the student, for the family. And the Ombudsman is meant more to kind of be a bit of a neutral arbiter. And I'll look up her number in a minute. We work with her a lot, and we often refer families there. I'll say that this question goes to the piece around climate, and in the course of understanding these issues and reading the research, because I'm getting into it and I'm saying, well, I was suspended, I was expelled as a kid. The Councilmember Grosso was suspended many times. He publicly speaks about this a lot. How he thought it was great every time he got suspended because he got to just go and hang out with his friends and do what he wanted to do and not be at school. And so, there's an intuitiveness that suspension is actually not a very good response. But we had to say to ourselves, okay, all these teachers and school leaders and even some parents are saying, well, if you don't let them suspend, schools will be less safe, it'll be dangerous. And so I had to go and really say, okay, well, let me really look at the research. There's not a ton, but there is some. And some of it really shows that it comes down to climate. And in a school with a positive climate and a climate that's actively kind of cultivated by the leadership, by the teachers, by the students, the parents, that's where very few suspensions happen. And that leads back to what we've heard from every school that we've gone to that says, yeah, we're trying not to suspend kids. We maybe suspended a couple last year. And it's something that the Councilmember Grosso speaks a lot about is love. right? And we don't talk a lot about that when we're talking about the law and criminal justice or education, but it's about approaching it from a perspective of love. And when you are modeling that as an adult within a school setting, that helps to, prevent these sort of situations from happening. And then if a situation does happen and a student, and this happens, I have a son who's 7. I'm a member of the LGBT community, and he has 2 moms, and he gets questions all the time. How do you have 2 moms, right? That's fine. That's a completely fine question for a young person to ask, right? But how does the teacher then respond to that? How does the teacher intervene? How do the other adults in the situation respond? And that comes back to this question of climate in the school and love, and figuring out a way to foster a climate where everyone feels that love and where everyone feels a member of the community and the relationships are established. And so that when accountability needs to happen, accountability can happen, but in a very different way from this kind of exclusion that we're used to not only in schools, but frankly our entire culture is based on, really, in a way, right? And just quickly, I wanted to also point out that actually, as Dr. Chatman noted, this issue around race and racial disparity, there has actually been quite a bit of research looking at and in DC we might think that the explanation for the racial disparity also has to do with socioeconomic status and poverty, and certainly that's part of it, and trauma and adversity is part of it, but it does not account for it entirely. And it does not account for it entirely across the board, but in particular, it does not account for it in the disparity for Black students. And I think that's why it's so important that we name anti-Black racism and white supremacy as we try to tackle these. And teachers are hungry for it. We find that teachers are just so anxious to get more training around restorative practices, around race and bias and implicit bias and responding to situations. So that's definitely an area we're looking at. How do we infuse more resources? How do we look at both the teachers that are already in our schools, but as Professor Alvarado mentioned, also have the school pipeline of new educators? How do we ensure that folks like you all that might be considering becoming teachers and educators, how do you get the training and the skills you need in these areas?
So I'll hand over here.
Good morning, my name is Pamela Fleming, and my question, well, actually, is kind of like a question and a statement. I wanted to know, I was listening to you talk about how the preschoolers, so many preschoolers get suspended over and over again. And so I wondered if the reason that they are getting suspended comes from, I know they have problems at home, but I'm wondering if our preschoolers are not feeling that love, not only from their parents, but from their teachers. And I'm wondering, I know there's a line where teachers can't maybe touch the students, but I'm wondering if maybe showing some more empathy or more love to the preschoolers, like when they act out, instead of wanting to immediately suspend them or send them to the corner, maybe sit down and hug them and find out what's wrong with them and just kind of like get a feel as to why it is that they're doing what they're doing. Because I work with 4 siblings now who I'm seeing that they exhibit issues or their behavior is indicative of not having love, feeling love, or being shown love. And so when you hug them or you kiss them on the forehead or whatever, it brings a smile to their face and they tend to start behaving better. So my question is then, is that something that can be implemented into the preschool program or something where the teachers can show a little bit more empathy and care for the children that they're in charge of, without just immediately wanting to discipline them?
Yes, Pamela, it can be implemented. I think, to go to the center of how you started this question about, the touching and whether that's an issue. It probably is an issue for some people because they haven't been raised with teachers giving a hug, perhaps, but there are ways to give a hug that no one will have a problem with. There are ways of just putting your hand on someone's shoulder and showing them support. Just giving them a smile will make a difference. But I think teachers really need a lot of help learning what are the strategies that will result in the behaviors they want. Punishment isn't the way to get there, but unfortunately a lot of teachers go to punishment because either that's what they were raised with, or that's what they've seen other teachers do, or that's the rules of the school, the 3 strikes and you're out, that kind of thing. So I think that there are other ways, and I did bring 2 resources that I want people to know about. One is called The Power of Guidance by Dan Gartrell, and it's a wonderful book that takes the approach you're talking about, and it helps us understand children's misbehavior in a different way. He doesn't use the term misbehavior, he talks about it, but his way of looking at children's behavior is to talk about mistaken behavior. Particularly with very young children, mistaken behavior takes sort of 3 levels. The first is like an exploratory behavior, experimenting. If you have young children, they want to try everything out, and sometimes that will result in a problem, because they're so inquisitive and it might end up hurting them or someone else. A second level is where they're socially influenced by their peers. But it's still mistaken behavior. They're not doing it to be mean or to be, hurtful to others. So that's also something that's mistaken. Now, it doesn't mean we want them to continue doing it. We have to step in and address it. But we don't have to step in and punish it. We can step in and guide it and teach children the appropriate way to deal. The third level is serious needs behavior, where children have gotten to the point, either emotionally, socially, where they are acting out what other people think they are. You're told enough times that you're the bad kid in the class, you start acting like the bad kid in the class. So there are methods for dealing with that. And I'll get to your question in just a second. But the other one I want to tell you about is a wonderful book called Beating Black Kids by a woman named Asada. And it's so wonderful because she not only looks at behaviors of how Black children are treated with corporal punishment, she also takes a historical look at this, about how it began in slavery and how a lot of slaves beat their children because they wanted to keep them from getting in a lot of trouble with the slave owners. And today we hear that talked about in terms of the police. A lot of people are very punitive with their children to keep them away from police and not to get into worse problems. So, I think that these are the kind of questions that we all need to struggle with and we all need to deal with. And the earlier we can do it, the better, because if we wait until children start getting expelled in high school, they have a whole history of pattern behavior that we have to deal with. So if we can start treating young children with respect and love from the beginning, we're not going to have some of these issues. She was.
I just want to make sure your mic's on.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
That's good.
Okay.
Test. Yeah.
Sorry, I just did not.
I wanted to add something really quickly. Last year, the Washington Post, because that's just easily accessible, did a short article on a study published by Yale University on implicit bias among preschool teachers, where they studied 130 preschool teachers and asked them to look out for troubling behavior or the problem children in a classroom. The children were actors. And using eye tracking technology, the study revealed that most of the teachers who were white teachers focused their attention on the black male children in the classroom, although all the kids were actors, right? So I agree with your point that we also have to look at teacher behaviors and how teachers are trained, because DC is a little bit special, and I grew up in DC, so I thought all school systems looked like ours, where most of the teachers were black and most of the students were black, but this is not what the real country is about. Many of the teachers of African American children are not themselves African American. That said, however, even many African Americans have internalized this implicit bias and internalized oppression. And I'm glad you said the word white supremacy first, because when it comes out of my mouth first, it becomes problematic. So thank you for acknowledging that, because we're in a place now where we can talk about hidden bias, implicit bias, white supremacy, white privilege. We can talk about those things, and we need to, because this is at the root of a lot of the problems that we're seeing. I'd also like to recommend the work of Dr. Jawanza Kunjufu, who has been talking about these issues about black boys in schools, Dr. Naeem Akbar, Dr. Monique W. Morris, whose book Push Out the Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools is phenomenal, and she speaks to these very same things that Professor Alvarado spoke to about black girls being expelled and suspended from school because they have dreadlocks, or because they wear short skirts, or because their bodies do not look like a girl's body should, or they're challenging gender norms around femininity. So these are the real, it's all a part of the challenge that we're facing and the work that we're doing together.
Global Children's Project, and we're trying to teach. I work for 3, 4, and 5 years, primarily 5 years, and I was trying to teach my kids. We were trying to teach the kids how to engage children globally, like maybe like if you connect on Facebook and you find a friend in China or Japan or somewhere across the country, to do different projects in our school and try to compare them to other countries. So then the kids started to question, how do we become connected with kids across the country, and it's not even unity in within the background. And so then I started to wonder, how do we begin to teach the kids that, how you be kind to one another in school, and then you leave out of school, and then you go home, and you're around a community in which you only see violence. And so then you train, it's like kids come to school with learned behavior. So you don't start it at 3, you don't start at 4, you don't start at 5, those learned behavior. So then how do you begin to teach the kids that this is not right, but then they leave and they go, and it's the same community, and it's the same, they see the same action and the same. And then you're only getting this for 7 hours a day or 8 hours a day. And sometimes you don't come to school at all, so you don't get it. And you come once a week or you come twice a week. And then it's a break. And then you come back and you start all over again, and it's fresh. So then how do you begin to build these kids up to teach them lifelong lessons? And then it's crazy because they come to our school, and our school is no suspension, no expulsion. So they don't get expelled and they don't get suspended, but then they don't get in trouble for their behavior. And it's kind of wow, I'm not going to get in trouble for this, because when I go home, I might get hit or I might get this. And, I put my hand out to hug the kids, and, they're clenching and they're doing this and they're doing that, and they're super afraid. And I'm trying to tell them, I'm not going to hurt you. But then they go home, when they leave out the classroom, and they get hit. And I'm okay, well, then my teacher just told me that, she won't hurt me, but then I'm not going to comfort from a parent or from a support giver, or so then how do you do it? I'm not understanding.
One of the principles that we try to instill in our early childhood education students is the importance of the teacher-parent partnership. We can't be doing something in isolation in the classroom with the children and expect it to carry over to what happens at home. The same with strategies that parents are using that might work well, or that they want used with children. They need to be discussing that with teachers. There needs to be a dialogue back and forth. And beginning parents, I remember years ago there was talk about when people had babies that hospitals should give out, a training in how to be a parent. Well, the same could be true of this issue that you're talking about. Before the parents establish a pattern of interacting inappropriately with their children, when they're infants, we should be having classes for parents so they can see the patterns that they're setting with children. What is it you really want to achieve with your child, and how can you best get there? And I think we'd have much better results. But when parents are dealing with a 5-year-old who's out of control, all they know is to try and control them.
They don't know how to deal with them in a way that will really get at the core of what is the issue for children. They don't know how to set limits. They don't know how to respond in a positive way. And they don't imagine that that's going to get them where they want to go. So I think, just the way we're talking about teachers need training, so do parents. But it really has to happen in concert with the teachers. I don't think it can be done separately.
I mean, I really thank you for talking about that. I think that's really one of the key pieces here is understanding how do we get at this. And it makes me think about what Councilmember Grosso often says, which is that the success of our students isn't just about what happens in the classroom. I mean, I think this is kind of what Professor Alvarado is saying too, right? It's about the entire community. And from our perspective as the legislative branch and as part of the government, it's about the entire government coming to bear to help, to be supportive. So how do you help ensure that maybe that parent needs some supports? Maybe it's about economics, maybe it's about anger management, maybe it's about give me some tools. How do I do when they're acting out? What am I supposed to do, right? And how it's complicated. I mean, there's definitely not one answer. And kind of like Dr. Chatman said, like restorative practices is not a silver bullet, right? It's all of these different pieces, and we have to look at it from all these different angles. One big theme this year has been mental health supports, behavioral health supports, getting more counselors, psychologists into schools, and then how do you also get, like, say, a community organization like Mary Center, for example, into the school so that they're working both with that student but also with their family and with their parents when they're outside of the school. There was a proposal on the table from the mayor to completely redo how we provide that, and it was going to really reduce the provision of mental health supports in school, and so the council stopped that, and now we're working to reformulate it and figure out what do we actually need and how do we get there. But I think that question is something we need to every day be trying to tackle.
Yeah, because I think the core of your question has to do with healing and the restoration that we need as a society. And so in order for that to happen, everybody has to be engaged, all stakeholders, not just schools, but churches and beauty shops, barber shops, grocery stores, everybody. But we have to acknowledge first that we need healing, because children that are being physically and verbally abused at home are very likely, it's because their parents were also physically and verbally abused. We have a lot of children who are dealing with trauma, and that trauma is multi-generational. And so part of that work also is challenging the stigma around mental health services and behavioral health, and acknowledging that we all need help.
But but they're already trying to send the kids to mental health services at 3 to put them on medicine. Like, how does it work? It's they're 3, 4, and 5, and you're already sending them to mental health services to put them on medicine. And all the parents talk about is a check. But how is that really helping the kids? So the kid is now on medicine at 3. The medicine probably have to last until he's 18. But this is a lifelong drug the kids can get in. Well, maybe not even 18, but it's a drug that the kids is going to help them physically think like, okay, I need this medicine to concentrate. But that's not even really the problem.
Like, it's not necessarily or at least when I'm talking about mental health services, not necessarily medication. Right?
Oh, okay.
It's about counseling, working with the family, with the parent around parenting techniques. Some of the really neat stuff we're seeing in schools is mindfulness, right? So just I'm thinking of one school, Houston Elementary. I think every classroom they start the day with like a little meditation, right? A little breathing practice. And this is something they're out doing at home, for sure, right? But maybe then they take it home and they say to their parents, hey, I'm doing this, why don't we try this? It's a lot of different angles. It doesn't have definitely
there's
getting right
a
to
lot
medication.
In my school system that gears towards medication. Like, I can't control this baby, he needs to be on some type of medicine. Well, I can't do this, she needs to do some type of medicine. And I try to ask them, like, so what does that do? How does that help your child? What does that do for your child other than just, like, kind of just put limit their I don't know the right word, but like how is that helping the child? And only thing they can keep hearing is a check and a check and a check, and it's just like, how is that benefiting the child really?
It's really layered and complex, and it's painful, and we'll probably have to talk about it after the program, but I worked in a level 4 special ed school, and that was also a motivation for many of the parents, the economic motivation behind receiving some financial benefits if their children had a particular diagnosis. To me, this is part of the oppression, part of the way that oppression affects our psyche and our understanding about who we are and what we can do and how we can govern our lives and not be reliant upon certain things. But it's very layered. It's very complex. I'm happy to talk with you more. And some attitudes you cannot change.
Yeah, I realized that.
Question over here.
So I have a question. Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Paradise Mingo. I have a question and a statement. Can you guys hear me? Okay. To make a statement to the young lady that just spoke, most parents, when it comes to their out of control children or their out of hand children, they lean more towards medicine because they don't really know about the resources that they have for their children. They don't know that they can do wraparound services. Medication is that thing that's pushed, just to control the dopamine level so that they can be, sitting down, but it still limits their learning because they're kind of like zapped out. So if you could tell them about some resources, Children's Hospital is amazing at behavior health, psychiatry, psychology, psychotherapy, therapists. I know I have a child with autism and I refuse to put him on medicine. Also, sometimes with the preschoolers, it's not them, it's their environment. So if they're going to a school that cannot accommodate them or cannot accommodate their IQ or their cognitive level, they're going to act out because they're bored. So, and not only that, I have a question for the panel. I've noticed that the preschool class is like 26 or 27 kids with only 2 teachers. And I know that that's pushing it. That's a lot of kids. And somebody's child or group of children is going to lack from either education or that lack of attention. So of course they're going to go kick on the wall, or they're going to, do something that's crazy to try to get that, that attention. And if they're in the back of the class and they can't see you or they can't hear properly, how can we incorporate smaller classroom sizes so that each and every child is not limited to what they're learning and not cheated?
That shouldn't really be the case, so I guess it depends somewhat on what the particular school is. I know for the most part at DCPS, it's definitely not that. That's definitely not, or that's not supposed to be the case. With charters, they have more autonomy to determine those things. But yeah, for pre-K3, I want to say the number is like 18 is supposed to be max, and I know it's still a lot, but definitely it shouldn't be 26. That's for sure. I think we do. One thing we are trying to better understand is where do we have schools that are struggling with that, and where do we not? Because when you look at the overall numbers, the ratios are actually really good in DC compared to the rest of the country. But I think that we need to maybe take out the one end and focus on the other end, right, of that spectrum, and figure out what are the schools that are having the challenges around the big numbers. And as we're trying to get more and more students into universal pre-K in DC, it is a challenge, and we run out of space in schools. And we have these perceptions that again goes back to white supremacy and anti-Black racism around what's a good school and what's not a good school based on who's at that school and who's traditionally gone to that school. When in fact, one school versus the other, they might have excellent, even better perhaps, instructors, but just because of the perceptions, right? And so, but that's definitely a challenge we will continue to have to face, and space is one, because of some of those imbalances around those perceptions. So if you have all the schools in Ward 3, for example, are bursting at the seams, whereas you got empty classrooms in some other parts of the city, and that really at the end of the day goes back to perception.
I have a question over here. Please introduce.
Hi, I'm Ava. I came in late and I apologize. But I wanted to ask a question because I am also part of the LGBTQ community, and ever since middle school, we've had safe spaces, like sort of like, here is where you are safe from anything, whether it be bullying from your students, judgment from your teacher, or anything along those lines. Why haven't we incorporated something like that in a lot of these elementary schools? Like, I think that could be a valuable thing for a safe space in elementary schools.
I'm not totally understanding what you're saying.
I'm kind of just saying that, like, there's a space where I'm emotionally allowed to be an emotional human in my high school or in my middle school. Why isn't there that for these emotional kids in elementary school, where, or even just that attitude? Like, it doesn't have to be a certain space, just like
That's
the
what
idea.
I would say.
Yeah.
I don't think there shouldn't be a space.
Right.
I mean, I recognize there is a time and a place for it, right? And there is, especially when you're dealing with pervasive social discrimination and misunderstanding, there's a space for separation. But particularly with the elementary school kids, like, come on, that entire space should be about love. That entire space should be about emotional support. And we also see that. I mean, this is part of the whole shift that I think we all have talked about, that we're seeing across the country and really here in DC, is everybody's getting it. Everyone's starting to say, wait, yeah, we can't only focus on the testing and the instructional time. It has to also be about social emotional learning. You have to be learning about relationships with your peers. It can't just be, it also can't only be for the little kids. Like, as young people grow, they need to continue to learn social emotional skills for different stages in life. Many of us, even as adults, could use, extra support in how we interact with each other. And so that's what I would say is the response. And I think we see a big emphasis on that now, which is really exciting. And we won't, we're not going to, the other part of all this that we're talking, as we talk about racial disparities in school discipline, we also have to talk about it in school outcomes, right? And achievement. And that's a huge area of disparity. And we won't tackle that if we don't tackle this part of stuff, I don't think. And the Councilmember says that every time he speaks.
Can I just respond also to the last question or two? Because you weren't just talking about ratios, you were also talking about how children are treated in these classrooms. It really comes back to teacher competency, and luckily, here at UDC Community College, we have 2 good degree programs to train teachers for working with preschool through grade 3, and we have a specific degree focused on people who are teaching infants and toddlers. But we need support for those kinds of programs from the public. And luckily, Councilman Grosso has a bill right now that is going to be voted on, I think on the 14th, that includes having 2 cohorts of infant, toddler caregivers and teachers in wards 7 and 8, so that people who are working there already, let's say as assistants in their programs, won't have to come all the way across town to, get their early childhood education classes. They can do it right where they work. So if any of you want to let your council members know to support those kinds of legislation, I think it would be helpful, because we have to train people. If teachers are not educated, if they don't understand the strategies they need to use in a positive approach with children, they're going to fall back on what they were raised with or what they think is going to work, which is punishment, and it's not the way to go.
My name is Maya Cameron, and I have been in the work of diversity and equity and inclusion for over 20 years. And one of the things that I unfortunately have to differ about is that the disparity between white teachers teaching students of color is one that is profound, and yet I don't see white teachers really embracing talking about their own white privilege and how power and privilege plays out. When I did training of white teachers, it was really easy for it to come into a guilt session rather than a proactive educational type session. And being mired in white guilt doesn't provide that kind of change and loving and inclusionary environment. So I'm just wondering, how can we implement, and maybe we start at UDC and then we think about it on a larger level, but how do we implement a safe space for white teachers to come together and say, we have to negotiate this, or we have to train the trainers so that white teachers can go out and speak to other white teachers, because that's where the power, so, okay.
I also do anti-racism training, and the same thing comes up in the training that I do. You have, if we separate the groups, and we have people of color in one group and whites in the other, the white group is all guilt-laden. The people of color are having a great time because this is the first time they've been able to talk freely about what's actually going on. But, I know a trainer in California, Bill Sparks, who specifically takes white teachers, he's white, he takes white teachers and talks to them about the history of anti-racism whites in this country and gives them a place to think about how they could change their behavior and create a space that is in support of, equal opportunity for all children. And I think that's not something that's been discussed with these teachers. They really don't know how to deal with it. All they know how to do is feel shame in the history. So I think that there is a way to start that conversation, but teachers need a lot of work around that. And they need, as you say, a place where they can talk on their own to be able to feel like they can be heard in a way that is not going to make them the bad guy all the time.
Thanks for raising that. I know Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings has done a lot of work around culturally relevant education, and lately has been focusing on this area also in terms of teacher preparation, and how we certainly do need to engage everyone in this undoing of racism and internalized racism, and teaching white teachers about racism and how we, even in our unconscious, subconscious ways, perpetuate sort of racial bias. I just came from a conference on contemplative practices in higher education in California, and there were a number of presenters there who use contemplative strategies, as I do in my teaching, such as meditation, mindfulness, journaling, reflective writing, all sorts of approaches to help students and to help educators develop more social emotional intelligence and to address these issues around equity or the lack thereof, diversity and inclusion in educational spaces. So I'll share some of those names with you, but a lot of these movements are growing. It's wonderful to see the anti-racist movement and contemplative pedagogy and mindfulness, all of these movements sort of talking about similar things, because I think they're very congruent in what we can do together in terms of unpacking this inequity.
I think, yeah, you're right. And I just would say it's white people, period, not just white teachers. And we just had an incident of that this morning at the council, where we're voting today on a resolution from a statement from the council calling for the removal of a statue over at Judiciary Square of a Confederate general. And the chairperson of the council, who's white, added some language into this resolution that said, well, in 1901, when the statue was erected, social values were different or something. It's like, no. White people had control, and their values were racism, as they have been, and black folks' values were not for that. And so, which society are you talking about? So, it's everybody. It goes up through our government as well. So, it's a challenge. It's an everyday thing, and just for, I know, along with other white folks in the room, just it's a constant. It's something we have an obligation to always speak to each other and remind ourselves about.
This seems like a conversation that could continue for a few more hours, even till late at night. But I hope that we will continue this conversation. Dr. Jowers Barber is collecting the texts that our panelists have recommended, and that will be sent out for those of you who put down your name on that list. So I want to again thank Dr. Jowers Barber for spearheading this panel, allowing me to put it on. Thank again our panelists for their participation and their insight on this issue. Thank you. And I'd also like to thank all of the faculty who brought their classes here today, who helped publicize the panel, and I'd like to thank our students, of course, for their insight and their questions. Okay?